BALLE Live webinar series on Local First. My name is Alyssa Barron-Menza, and I serve as Managing Director at BALLE. We have several dozen communities from across North America registered for today's webinar, and we're delighted to have you all with us. I'm going to review a bit of housekeeping, provide a few reminders about this webinar series, and then we'll introduce our topic and speakers for today. So if you're dialed in by phone, but you've not joined us in the webinar room, please find a link in your reminder email from Ali Walker. Because of the number of webinar participants, we have the phone line muted. So if you have a question for the presenters at any time during the webinar, you can type your question in the public chat window to the right of your screen. Ted or Walter may answer questions during the presentation, but we'll hold most to the end of the webinar when we have time set aside for moderated Q&A. If you have technical difficulties at any point during the webinar, you can note those in the chat window, and our staff member, Ali Walker, will send you a private chat to help you get it sorted out. The private chat shows up as a new tab to the right of the public chat window in the top right corner of your screen, which flashes red once the private chat has been initiated. After each webinar, we email everyone registered a link to the full recording of the webinar along with presentation slides and a copy of the questions from the chat window. So watch for those materials in an email from Ali over the next few days. So our Local First webinar series features innovative strategies at the level of individual businesses and networks of businesses that effectively make the case for local and result in more buying and thinking local first. Each webinar is focused on tools and strategies you can take home and try out right away. We know that driving demand for local products and services is a critical piece of building the localist movement and taking mainstream. Locally produced goods and locally owned businesses have received a surge in support and awareness over the last several years thanks to many of the Think Local First campaigns across North America. We continue to support this movement by showcasing effective models, campaigns, policies, programs that expand ownership and shift purchasing towards locals first. We suggest you treat these Local First webinars as an opportunity to bring together, great, I was just getting a cue that I sound good. Great, we were having audio problems in our tech dry run. Glad we're sounding good. So these series, we suggest you treat these as an opportunity to bring together a group of business owners, local economy conveners, funders, any Local First supporters in your community who are interested in the topic. After listening to the webinar, you might spend an hour discussing with your group the relevancy to your community. To leverage the impact of the webinars, we highly encourage these viewing parties and roundtables, so you'll never have to pay extra per attendee on the same webinar line. Starting last month and continuing into 2013, we're doing a deep dive on local procurement as the next generation of Local First work. In the United States, as much as 6% of GDP comes from the spending of anchor institutions. So our consumer-focused Local First work is still critically important, but it's only a piece of the potential hundreds of millions of dollars in buying power we can direct to local enterprises. Our aim is to advance the local purchasing and procurement as a part of a city's economic growth strategy, creating more jobs, more community services by localizing the goods, services, and food purchased by local and county state agencies, large businesses, and anchor institutions like hospitals and universities. Last month, we featured a model for advancing government agency procurement by Local First Arizona. A recording of that webinar is available on our website for anyone who missed it. Next month, we'll feature Source Detroit, which has redirected $17 million in spending to local businesses in Midtown Detroit after just a few years of working with 3 anchor institutions, a university, a hospital, and another medical complex. We'll learn what steps they've taken and how you can follow suit. So for full details about our Local First and other webinar series, you can go to our website, bealocalist.org. And in the coming few days, we'll be posting information about our 2013 webinars along with links to registration, so stay tuned. So today, we are really delighted to have 2 gentlemen with us who are national pioneers in advancing local procurement by anchor institutions. We've got Ted Howard, who's the Executive Director of the Democracy Collaborative, and Walter Wright, who's the Project Director of the Greater University Circle Community Wealth Building Initiative of the Cleveland Foundation. So we're going to hear today what's worked in Cleveland, not only with the Evergreen cooperatives, which many of you know well, but a broader strategy across Cleveland to encourage anchor institution procurement through local businesses, but we're also going to hear a sample of what's working and what's being tried in cities across the country. So we're really delighted to have both Ted and Walter with us today to kind of understand what's happened in Cleveland and beyond. So with that, Ted, I'm going to turn it over to you to get us started.
Great. Thank you very much, Alyssa. And hello, everybody. Walter and I are sitting here in the offices of the Cleveland Foundation here in Cleveland, Ohio. It's very good to talk with all of you. Our topic today, as you can see, is leveraging anchor institutions to build community wealth. I'm going to begin speaking for 13 or 14 minutes, then turn it over to Walter, and then we'll open it up for your questions, which Alyssa will moderate. So the first question, of course, is what is an anchor institution? And I suspect most of you know that, but just some of the things at the Democracy Collaborative we think of when we think of anchors. One, anchors are really sticky capital. That is, they're the kinds of institutions in a community that don't get up and leave. Here in Cleveland, Ohio, there used to be more Fortune 500 corporations headquartered in Cleveland than any city other than New York City. This is back in the 50s. And today there are maybe 2 of those Fortune 500 left. So we know these large corporations come and go from our communities. What kinds of institutions stay? And those are anchor institutions. And there also tend to be very large economic engines in our communities, very large employers, typically nonprofit. And as you'll see, in our view at least, they are an enormous untapped potential for empowering local businesses through procurement, investment, and the like. The types of anchor institutions, typically they're called eds and meds, that is the universities and hospitals. But again, there are a whole constellation of these place-based large institutions, local governments, obviously. A government in Cleveland's not going to up and move to China, so it's very much an anchor. Museums, performing arts centers. A number of people are starting to consider sports teams anchor institutions, and usually they are. And I have to say that with a bit of a caveat, because some of you who are football fans may know that some years ago the Cleveland Browns up and moved to Baltimore. There's a new football team here now, so they do sometimes move, but generally not. They stay in place. Alyssa referenced one of these statistics in her introductory remarks. There is an enormous potential for local procurement from just the eds and meds alone. This slide shows the annual procurement. If you aggregate all the hospitals, almost all of which are nonprofits, some are publicly owned county hospitals, a small percentage, less than 10, are for-profit hospitals. But you aggregate their procurement and the university procurement, and it's north of $1 trillion a year, year in, year out. That's not their construction budget. That is not their personnel costs, their salaries. It's just the purchase of goods and services to keep their doors open. $1 trillion, 6% of GDP, being spent by institutions that almost never exit a community. So the question really is, how much of that trillion can be driven locally? And endowments should also be remembered, because they're close to $1 trillion in endowment investments. And frankly, most of these endowments are not invested with an eye to how can these assets be deployed to build up the local community as well as return something favorable to the institution. So there's 2 pools of money that are of interest, but we're going to focus on procurement here. Why? What are the benefits of local procurement? Well, we think it's a win-win situation. For the institutions, because their vendors are nearby, they can often have much better vendor service. At these times of fragility of the communication and transportation grid that we've seen with, for instance, this recent superstorm Sandy, as well as what's taken place in China in Japan, with the tidal wave, what we saw with Katrina, being dependent on goods and services that are coming perhaps thousands of miles can be very dicey. And many institutions feel it's much better to localize their vendors. If we're concerned about sustainability, as I know everybody on this call is, being able to cut out 1,000 or 2,000 miles of carbon-based transportation in terms of the goods and services you're buying is something that can help anchor institutions achieve their own sustainability goals. But obviously, local procurement also greatly benefits the community, and you all know this very much. It creates local jobs. It drives money into the neighborhoods. It creates a multiplier effect. People that have jobs through these procurement opportunities go and spend their money with other vendors locally. So there are a lot of benefits, we think, for everybody in this game, the spenders and the suppliers of the goods and services. I won't go through these slides in great detail, the next two slides, but what I did want to say is there are a lot of good examples of anchor institutions that are starting to use their buying power and their investment power in ways that are starting to really make a contribution to the communities in which they're based. That was not the case, say, 15 years ago. Institutions tended to be walled off from their communities. They weren't looking at how to conduct themselves as, in a sense, good corporate citizens. But that is really changing around the country. Now, there's a long way to go. We're only halfway down the road. But there's a tremendous amount taking place. At the University of Pennsylvania, which is a national leader in localizing procurement, those of you who've been to Penn know that it's adjacent to the neighborhoods of West Philadelphia, which are historically a very disinvested, low-income set of neighborhoods. And when Penn decided they were going to start to drive procurement locally, they only were purchasing $1 million or $2 million a year of goods and services from West Philadelphia. After a 15-year effort, they're up to almost $100 million a year being purchased locally, which is making a real difference in the local neighborhoods. This University of Cincinnati example is interesting because the $100 million the university has invested in different kinds of local businesses and development, it has come from their endowment. They've put more than 1/10 of their endowment assets into local investments, which is very good for local business. And there are a lot of other examples, as you can see, and we're happy to talk about them. And at the end of this webinar, there'll be a couple links to resource websites, and you'll find a lot more on those websites. Hospitals are also in the game. You're going to hear about Detroit next week, but Henry Ford Hospital is making a real effort through their Live Local, Buy Local, Hire Local initiative to drive procurement locally. In Cincinnati, the Health Alliance, as it says, exceeded a target of $23 million of purchasing from local minority and female-owned businesses. So there's, again, a lot of momentum, a lot of possibility. I wanted to spend my last couple minutes here talking about something going on here in Cleveland some of you may have heard of, which is the Evergreen Cooperative Initiative. Its goal is threefold, as it says here, to create jobs, and particularly for low-income residents of 6 neighborhoods in the city of Cleveland. There are 43,000 folks who live in those neighborhoods. Unemployment is probably perhaps 25, 30%, 40% of the people living below the poverty line. So we're trying to create jobs. We're generating wealth because we're creating these companies as employee-owned, broadly owned businesses, as cooperatives. And the goal is to stabilize the neighborhoods of Cleveland. The thing that's relevant for this phone call is this is an anchor-based strategy. We have a number of major anchor institution partners here in Cleveland who are participating as customers and investors in this strategy, and they include the Cleveland Clinic, University Hospitals, Cleveland Museum of Art, Case Western Reserve University, VA Hospital, and the like. If you take just 3 of the anchors, Cleveland Clinic, UH, and Case, as it says, they purchase every year $3 billion of goods and services, and yet they're surrounded by neighborhoods where 40% of the people live below the poverty line. So obviously that $3 billion and very little of it is making it into the neighborhoods at all. So that's what we're working to achieve here. We've started 3 companies, local, community-based, and worker-owned companies. The Evergreen Cooperative Laundry, which does healthcare bed linen laundry for anchor institutions, hospitals, for nursing homes, retirement homes. 25 people have been hired so far and are working at living wage jobs, getting no-cost health benefits, and as the company is profitable, they receive a share of the profits. Evergreen Energy Solutions is a solar installation company, does big solar arrays on the roofs of the large anchor institutions. And Green City Growers is probably the largest local food effort in a core urban area in the country, and it's certainly the largest urban-based food production hydroponic greenhouse in the United States. We've assembled 10 acres of land in the heart of Cleveland, and on it built a 3¼ acre, almost 200,000 square foot greenhouse that will be producing 3 million heads of lettuce annually and 300,000 pounds of herbs like basil for the local food market. And the interesting thing here is that in Northeast Ohio, some of you, if you're in Buffalo or other places, you'll resonate with this. Virtually all of our lettuce is trucked in 2,000 miles from the west coast of the United States. So this is a local food effort, but creating year-round employment. And yesterday, I'm happy to report, on 12/12/12, since the world didn't end, according to the Mayan calendar, we decided we'd do our first planting. And yesterday, the first 9,000 lettuce plants were planted, on the way to 3 million being planted in this facility. I think I have one or two last slides. So our strategy in sum here is to work with our local anchor institutions, and your communities have them just like we do in Cleveland, to win their support for an institutional buy local strategy and identify local purchasing that could be done through these institutions to build up the local economy. Second, we're creating through this strategy a new network of community-based cooperative businesses under the brand name of Evergreen that are matched directly to the supply chain of these institutions. We have 3 now, but the goal is to have dozens over time built up in this community. Third, these companies are green. As a business proposition, we want to ensure that an evergreen business is the greenest in its sector, and we're trying to move to some scale here so that we're not just doing a couple small businesses, but a network of interrelated businesses. And my last slide, our goals, as I said, we want to create jobs. We want to base this business strategy and capital in the community so it doesn't get up and leave. We want to promote not only living wage jobs, but asset accumulation for our workers through ownership in their company. This is, in many ways, a kind of import substitution strategy, so we want to stop money from leaking out of Northeast Ohio so we can get a multiplier. And we're hoping to develop something that's useful in other communities. And I should say that at last count, there are 15 different cities around the country that range from a small community like Amarillo, Texas, to a large city like Atlanta, Georgia, which themselves are starting to develop their own evergreen-inspired models. Not necessarily exactly like this, but an anchor institution local purchasing strategy with its component of a broad ownership structure in the businesses. So with that, I'll complete and turn it over to my colleague, Walter Wright.
Hi, everybody. It's really great to join you today. And I'm going to talk, Ted talked on sort of the big overall 30,000-foot view, and he was here at the foundation before I was implementing Evergreen. I came in as part of a Living Cities local integration initiative, and I was charged with getting this local procurement initiative actually in the ground with our 3 partners, Cleveland Clinic, UH, and Case Western Reserve. So this is what Ted has covered previously. He had interviewed numerous people in the neighborhood environment to find out what local purchasing was and found very little. So we started to ask some questions. When I came in 2 years ago, we convened focus groups with procurement people, and the Cleveland Clinic alone has 100 folks working in procurement. But what vendors exist locally to bid? What companies can be attracted to the region? Businesses to start? How to ID companies to send RFPs to, how we can make an environment opportunity and info-rich. And hospitals, 60% of the purchasing is physician-directed. Pharmacy or blood is a huge portion of that spend. So there's 40% that's discretionary, but of that, 20% of the suppliers are 80% of the buy. So there are some potential sweet spots. We surfaced some issues here right away, is how do you determine local? And actually, what we found that folks had in their databases, procurement folks in many cases just have P.O. boxes for third-party bill-paying providers, and they have no idea where companies are located. What do you track? Do you track the spend, or do you actually track employment? Spend is important, but we're trying to move low-income people. And so that looking at employment and jobs created is our #1 priority, but somewhat harder to track. And if a national company has significant local employment, for our purposes, perhaps we'd consider them local. What kind of database might be useful? Who tracks and updates the info? Who owns the data? All this stuff has come up and continues to come up. Because really, basically, what we're trying to do is we're trying to recreate something that has been dismantled over 50 years or so. I think a lot of purchasing used to be local. There were local banks supporting local businesses. And a lot of that through globalization and outsourcing has been deconstructed, under-supported, fallen away. So we're trying to reignite some of those businesses here locally that can still serve that function, build them up with capacity, and connect them to the institutions. So other things, when we started looking at databases, we started to find that procurement people didn't want to have multiple databases to try to deal with. They already felt it was complicated. And they also have some robust work underway already in Cleveland on minority spend. That's been, emerging over the past 15 years, really in the last 5 years, quite strongly. What about energy? We have one of our companies for Evergreen is an energy company. If it's locally sourced, is that a local company? Typically, energy is excluded. Who does the high-touch work? So you can put a database in place, but who is going to go out and meet with the vendors and inform them how to fill out an RFP? And who's going to go and meet with the anchor institution purchasing folks and educate them? And are there other incentives in terms of employment performance bonuses or other ways to keep people on track? Because again, we're disrupting a system in a sense and replacing it with something new. So the other issue is the FTC regulations. Our hospitals are under a lot of scrutiny. They're nonprofits. They have community benefit function, but price fixing or the suspicion of that could open them to litigation. So by collaborating together on broader economic goals and being member of a third-party agent, either a not-for-profit or a group purchasing organization, or having a foundation partner such as the Cleveland Foundation, who is a convener and viewed as an honest broker, can protect them from that sense, because clearly there are bigger goals and this is not about price fixing. There are multiple opportunities, I think. Obviously, we said, pharmacy and blood is typically not something that's local, but we've identified some of these. Local food is great, janitorial services, landscaping, snow removal, printing and marketing collateral. Architectural has some opportunity for some higher spend expertise, pest control, waste and recycling, office supply, couriers, IT. In fact, one of these efforts that happened very simply was that there was a local courier who was identified who was very competitive. One of the anchors was working with them already and just simply informed the other anchor about the service that had been so good, and that became a buy local spend before we had a buy local program underway. So Ted was speaking about UH. UH, number of years ago, implemented their Vision 2010 program when they had a major capital campaign, construction projects. They were able to really focus on that and have 93% of those local contractors, 17% of them MBEs, minority-owned businesses, 7% female, 18% of the workers were local. And now a couple of years later, the enduring results is of the 110 small companies they worked with during this process, they now regularly work with 30 of them. We're also working, Ted is working with MIT to develop a paper about that work. Now here we are, we're still working with how do we create a database, and there are some struggles about that. I'll tell you that frankly, defining what is local, sharing information with a competitor, changing the culture of an institution, a lot of this is relationship-based. For procurement, people have in some cases been there for many years, building relationships with their suppliers, and changing that takes a lot of work. It's a heavy lift. But even just having the conversation without having formal policies in place in many cases, cited the greater university circle effect, that out of their $100 million annual spend, that's roughly a quarter to local goods and suppliers that is discretionary, 25% of that $100 million was in Ohio and 90% was in the northeastern Ohio. So this has prompted the discussion with Cleveland Clinic and UH and the Cleveland Foundation how we continue to build on this. recently, university hospitals, they have committed to this, and in the top bullet point here, commitment to transparency, all purchases greater than $20,000 must be competitively bid and should include at least 3 vendors with 1 or more bid participants who are qualified, minority, local, or female-owned business, and that's a fantastic effort that we can build on. And then local food is one of the first places. You know, everybody uses a large provider like AVI or Sodexo, but they can work with them to build in local food. Last year, Cleveland Clinic set a goal for 10% of local food, and they had actually built this from one staff person who was their sustainability person who was running down to meet folks from the Amish community with a bucket of blackberries, and they would figure out how to incorporate that in their lunch. And then they started a farmer's market, and now they've built this into their contracts with food providers that it has to be locally sourced. So they exceeded their goal last year of 10% and reached a standard of 12% local food, and the Cleveland Clinic buys an enormous amount of food. So that's my presentation, and I'll just highlight for you that what we're working on now really robustly is creating a database. There are a lot of databases out there. There are minority databases and diversity councils. That work is good, but a lot of it doesn't really have local as a metric. We've talked with them about incorporating local as a metric, and that protects them in some ways. We've seen in some cases where there was a female or minority-owned business that was a lot of the spend of one of the institutions, and there was a change in management there, and they lost the designation. Still the same company, still operating in the same neighborhood, still providing the same jobs and services, but it punched a hole in some of the community benefit that they were getting from working with that vendor. So looking at local as an additional metric, in addition to the minority and female or disadvantaged business, provides some benefit in that way as well, which is something I wouldn't have anticipated. But the difficulty here, and we're falling down some of a parallel track that folks did in the diversity spend some years ago. At first it was surfaced as a good idea, something we should do. Then there was a lot of struggle with how do we put that into place, and who do we hire, and how do we track that, and how do we make sure that people are complying. And then eventually it just becomes part of the way that these companies operate. And I'm thinking that with the local spend, we are in some of that right now. People are sort of figuring out how to implement this. There's a lot of struggle. There's pushback in some cases. There's culture change that needs to happen, and it's not an easy thing to do. But I think we're actually starting to having some reportable benefits to this effort. And we are part of, as Ted pointed out, a national effort. I think we'll all learn from one another. We are learning that there are different companies that provide some buy local database services. We are currently interviewing at least 4 of those to see if they can provide what we need. We've also identified a third party here to sort of hold that database that would be neutral, and also they would provide a concierge service for both the vendors and for the procurement people at the local, at our anchors, to help ensure that there's communication, because there is, and again I stress, a lot of high-touch work that has to happen here. Detroit is also a local initiative, Living Cities neighborhood, and so we met with them and their procurement people and their work, and I'm familiar with that, and we're working down some parallel areas and sharing information back and forth. So welcoming more folks to this buy local effort, I think will ultimately benefit all of us. And with that, I'm completed with mine. Ted has put up some really helpful links here at the conclusion of my presentation. There are links there, and I will also provide folks later on with my email for additional questions that we don't cover in the discussion period to follow.
Thank you both, Ted and Walter. So Ted, let's start by having you explain a little bit about some of the resources that are at these websites, because I know you've got reports, and David from Binghamton referenced using one of them. You've got toolkits. There's just a wealth of information. So could you walk us through some of what's out there for folks who want to go a bit deeper?
Yep, happy to, Elisa. So the community-wealth.org, and you need the dash in that, website is a web portal that has been developed by the Democracy Collaborative at the University of Maryland, of which I'm the executive director. And it really is designed to bring together across the board the broad range of what we call community wealth building institutional mechanisms and strategies and local policies. We've talked a lot here about the role of anchor institutions. You'll find a very large section on anchor institution best practices and models, academic literature, studies that we've done in the Democracy Collaborative, including one called The Road Half Traveled that looks at a number of universities around the country who are developing innovative economic development strategies. We have, by the way, shortly after the first of the year, a large report on called Hospitals Building Healthy Communities about how hospitals as anchors are beginning to purchase locally, like that University Hospitals example. But in addition, CommunityWealth.org also looks at employee-owned firms, buy local campaigns, co-ops, land trusts, social enterprise. So it's a whole range of things and lots of technical assistance links you can get. Evergreen Cooperatives is the website of the Evergreen movement here in Cleveland. And those of you interested in exploring whether an evergreen type strategy makes sense in your community, if you go to that evergreencooperatives.com website, you'll find a whole section on a toolkit. And it really kind of walks you through what are the questions that need to be asked. How do you bring anchor institutions to the table? What's the role of local philanthropy in these kinds of strategies? What role does the public sector, particularly the city government, play? And then the Cleveland Foundation website is one on which you have to drill down a little bit, but is where you'll find a good amount of material on the Greater University Circle initiative, which Walter was describing. So those three, there are lots of other good resources, but pretty much if you go to those three, you'll find links to just about all the other resources around the country and even internationally, and I suspect to a number of your organizations locally.
Thank you, Ted. And you've mentioned the Living Cities and initiative a couple of times, so maybe that would be a good question for you, Walter, just to explain a little bit more what that is.
Sure. So Living Cities is a national funding collaborative consisting of large institutions such as Rockefeller, Ford, Casey, Gates, and also large financial institutions like the Bank of America, MetLife, Chase. And for some 20-plus years, they have sort of supported directly or through intermediaries affordable housing. And with the housing crisis, they started to revisit their mission, and in attempting to address the long-standing problems that are creating poverty in our urban cities, they developed an initiative that took place that was developed in 2010 and launched in 2011, which was called the Integration Initiative. They asked 19 cities to apply, and 5 were invited to participate, and it's Cleveland, Baltimore, Newark, Detroit, and the Twin Cities. 4 of these are weak market cities, and all of them were invited back for initiatives that were underway. In some cases, it was a large transportation project. Baltimore was working on workforce issues. Cleveland and Detroit are working with anchor institutions. And Newark is working on food policy. But we had the existing Evergreen Cooperative, and when Living Cities started to work with us, what we started to use our funding for was some of the connecting the dots, looking at local procurement, looking at the workforce issues, looking at community engagement, how all of those can be networked. So the Evergreen effort is integrated, is integral to this. I will point out that really the more long-standing effort is called Greater University Circle, and was the effort some 7 years ago by the foundation to join the anchor institutions together for mutual benefit. So all of this work is kind of nested, and one entity works with the other. But I've been able to use funding to support some of this work, and I will point out that we did early on get some commitments from the CEOs of the anchor institutions to do the local procurement work, but there are a lot of steps that are necessary in order to actually make that happen. And what we found in the cities that are doing this is that it can consume a lot of staff energy. It can entail some expense. And so we're trying to figure out how to do it in the most efficient way. And because this is sort of, I think this is something that sort of comes around. It's kind of a strategy that people look at over and over again. And because we've been so deeply entrenched with globalization for 20-some plus years, this does entail looking at systems that have been disinvested in. So as we've disinvested in communities, we've also disinvested in local supply chains and supply support organizations and funding for small business and capacity building for small business. So there's some work to do here. Big institutions like the Cleveland Clinic typically look at their contracts. They don't want to have to deal with multiple vendors to remove snow from their facility for efficiency's sake. They'll consider it if people work well together. There are other issues too here about bonding, covering the bond for small vendors. There's also the issue about how long do you stretch out receivables, and the small businesses need payment quicker than multinational corporations do. So those are some of the issues that we're addressing here in addition that I didn't touch on previously.
Okay, well, I think we may have some time to dive in. I see a question from Andrew. Can we speak to the legal issues that may be specific to working with anchor institutions on local procurement that need to be attended to? And so that's a big question. Maybe we'll start with you, Ted, and then see what you have to add, Walter.
Sure. This is Ted. It's useful, I think, when looking at anchor strategies to distinguish between public and private anchor institutions. And by private, I mean, in our case, the Cleveland Clinic, Case Western Reserve University, University Hospitals. Those are all 501c3 nonprofit institutions, but they're private. They don't have public requirements. It's, in effect, the CEO and his or her procurement people and management can pretty much decide to do what they want. So if they want to buy locally, they can. It's more difficult working with public hospitals, for instance, because they're public hospitals. There will be county or state regulations. They may not be able to give a real preference to local. They may be required to only take the cheapest bid. There are, I think we're finding in other cities, sort of skillful ways to insert local into that equation. But it's just more complex when you have a public institution, a public university system, for instance. So that's one issue, is being clear what's public and private. And then Walter, of course, raised this issue, and you may want to add to it, Walter, about federal regulations that preclude collusion among institutions locally, and how we're in effect addressing that issue here in Cleveland.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think if the institutions are making good faith efforts to improve the local economy by driving purchasing there, I think it protects them in a lot of ways from this. I think in some ways this can be a bit of resistance to change, to say, well, we have to be careful about opening ourselves to lawsuits from vendors who feel we're being preferential or we're price fixing. I think some of that really is just sort of a bit of the natural resistance to changing existing relationships on the part of some procurement folks. They're not here in the room to push back on me on that, but that may be part of it. But I think part of this is just that if folks are working with an entity like the Cleveland Foundation, and we're working with a third party who is going to be assisting with holding this information with them in a database, it provides some protection to them from that exposure. But I also think some of this, we're working in Cleveland with the number 1 and the number 2 hospital systems, so they're competitors. And they are, on the one hand, wanting to work together. On the other hand, they're wanting to preserve their competitive advantage. So sharing information about your spend is something that they are a bit leery of. We're working through these issues kind of step by step. But I think what is actually happening here, and why I pointed to some results that have actually occurred prior to us even making some systematic changes or changes in policy, is that this is based on relationships. And now when we've got the Cleveland Clinic and the UH, they're talking together. Actually, the Steve Stanley, who's the head of operations, chief of operations at the clinic, meets with Bill Peacock, who's the chief of operations Steve's at UH, and he meets with Bill Peacock. And they're talking about how they can, not only be competitors, but they both share this pool of resources here in the local economy. If the local economy is doing better, both institutions do better. So they're starting, based upon these relationships now, people are starting to talk with one another. They're starting to cooperate, and I think Evergreen has been an amazing platform for bringing people in the room to talk about how they're starting businesses together, providing services that both institutions or all three institutions can use. And that has provided now a platform for us to talk about day-to-day procurement. In some cases, we now have a guy who's a local entrepreneur who's starting a bakery for ex-offenders. And I was at a meeting yesterday talking about procurement with UH in the clinic, and we started to talk about how we could, connect this person with the person who's in procurement there for food. And so some of this is just the informality of having regular contact with folks at the institutions who are in good faith working together. I think some of these other systems that we're developing take someone more work because they are sort of regulated activities, or they're activities that cost money or staff time. But I think a lot of the wins, a lot of the quick wins are just happening because we're actually convening people to speak with one another.
Elizabeth, this is Ted. Could I make an additional point here?
Of course.
And it's sort of triggered by something Walter said, but it's a bit different, but I wanted to get this on the table. I think it's very, very important. I've been in sort of dealing with anchor institutions for 15 years or so now around a lot of these issues. And it's really important to put on the table here that, these institutions, they may want to do right by the community. They may have, community benefiting inclinations. But at the end of the day, there's a lot of self-interest at play here. And so, the appeal to the charitable aspect of the institutions is fine, but if this isn't good business for them, and since there are a lot of people here on this call, I think, who are business people in local setting, you'll appreciate this. If it's not a sound business decision, and if there's not a really useful self-interested case that could be made, it's very difficult to move these big bureaucracies. Now, I think the shared self-interest between the community and the institution is good to emphasize, but, I think that if you look, for instance, at eds and meds, one of the very interesting things about those two sectors is both hospitals and universities nationally are in the forefront of trying to green their institutions. There's a compact of hundreds and hundreds of university presidents, for instance, that have made a declaration, to shrink the carbon footprint of their campuses over time and so forth, and hospitals similarly. And so, appealing to them and interacting with these institutions not only around the benefit to the community and the local economy, but to understand their sustainability goals and build a case for why buying local and using local vendors, because of the transportation it cuts out and all the other things, it can actually be a way for institutions to achieve their sustainability goals. In Amarillo, Texas, in the Panhandle, where I've been working, there are two hospitals there. And we may be not talking about building a laundry ultimately, but one hospital, which doesn't do its laundry in Amarillo because there's not a facility, sends its laundry every day 250 miles away to Albuquerque. So 500 miles of round trip to wash sheets and towels on a daily basis. The other hospital sends their laundry 300 miles away one way to Oklahoma City. So,
that's insane.
So there's, you can make a case, isn't it better to spend our money locally because it puts people to work? And by the way, they're going to have health insurance, and they're not going to come to your hospital's emergency room as their primary provider because they'll be able to have a doctor. And by the way, isn't it better to cut out all these transportation miles, not only for the environment, but gasoline prices are only going to go up. So there's a whole complex building of a case here that I think is really important in dealing with these institutions.
Well, and so I imagine that there's parts of making that case that are really specific to each community and each anchor institution, but are there resources on these websites, or are there other resources we could share where you guys have made the case in Cleveland or in other communities where people could, kind of get inspiration from the particular arguments you've already put together?
Well, you'll certainly find that on the Evergreen Cooperative's website. There are a number of articles and reports and things we've written which look at all the aspects of this case, and obviously I'm happy offline and by email and so forth to respond to people's questions about that. The other point I'd make here is, again, if you look at an Evergreen strategy, while there's a big social mission to it, again, at the end of the day, for these institutions, it's very much a business proposition. So we're not asking, for instance, a hospital to do business with the Evergreen Cooperative Laundry because, in quotes, we're the good guys, and pay us 2 cents more a pound. We go in cost competitive. We go against the big guys, and sometimes we win the contracts and sometimes we don't. And I think that's important too. This is very much a for-profit business strategy that, at the end of the day, these businesses, just like the businesses of everybody on this call, need to be able to make it in the market, but they have the advantage because of a relationship with these anchor institutions, which aren't exiting the community, of having a long-term customer and partner if the services are good and professional and cost-effective.
Yeah, and I'd also emphasize the role of the public sector here. We have a great partner in the city of Cleveland that has directed investment along our health tech corridor, which links our downtown to University Circle to Uptown, where the anchor institutions have their facilities. And so they've directed a lot of investment in creating incubators and looking at supply chain. BioEnterprise is the entity that was created by our anchor institutions to create biomedical opportunities for them and to monetize some of the research that's been being done on the university level for healthcare. And they've started to work on a supply chain strategy, and this integrates with our buy local. Because if we know where the spend is and we know what the need is, we can attract or build more companies here locally, and then we're building part of this infrastructure with the support of the city and other entities to make it more robust. And then ultimately what it is for UH that just built the stunning new cancer center in University Circle, they're protecting their investment if they're directing investment and purchasing into these neighborhoods.
Okay, thank you. So we've got a question here that I anticipated, which is how do you generate revenue in order to be able to cover the cost of this work? So there's, taking a step back, Ted and Walter, how have you paid for the staff time, and what levels of staff time have really gone into your work, say, for example, in getting this work off the ground in Cleveland? And that really goes to the question, how can others replicate pieces of that and kind of understand how many years, how many staff it's taken to really do something like this?
Well, let me give a shot to that. That could be a 3-hour seminar. But
maybe
quickly,
we'll do that. Yeah.
And Walter and I have the scars to prove it. Very quickly, I think there are a number of essential ingredients in something like an Evergreen strategy, without which it doesn't work. Walter's referenced one. The role of the public sector is very important, and we could describe that. The role of the anchor institutions, obviously, if the anchors don't play, you don't have an anchor strategy. But for me, I think the essential element to get something like what we're talking about off the ground is the role of what I call homegrown philanthropy. It could be the community foundation, as it was in the case of Cleveland, where the Cleveland Foundation, the oldest and first community foundation in the country, really got behind this strategy. It could be other kinds of local place-based funders. But, not the kind of foundations that are just funding issues all over the country, but foundations that are rooted in a community, whether they're community foundations or private, and have an interest in issues like living local economy, addressing poverty, joblessness, workforce development, entrepreneurism, that sort of mix of things, and bringing them in at the very beginning to show them why, as funders, if they put money into this, given the power and the economic strength of these anchor institutions, the investment of X by a community or other local foundation could unlock 10X resources from these other institutions. So it's a very high leverage kind of investment that foundations make. And
so that's where you would start, it sounds like,
so.
The entrepreneurs and the local economy conveners, the BALLE networks and other kinds of conveners that are on the call, that maybe the conversation starts with their foundation and helping underwrite some of the work to create these relationships and ultimately the infrastructure, that the databases and the other things that help local procurement really happen.
Exactly, and building a conversation and a shared vision with these funders and local institutions about the possibility that can arise if this grouping of local institutional actors comes together. I think what I found in city after city where I've spoken and worked is that, this just makes sense to people. Look, we've got these assets right here. They're spending all this money daily, but not quite through the lens of how do we spend and get what we need as an institution, and along with that, benefit the community more. And, I've found, Amarillo is a really conservative place. Cleveland's a kind of, bluest city in America, and Amarillo's like the reddest. And it doesn't matter. This approach is not a liberal or conservative or red or blue approach. It makes sense because it's harnessing the resources of our community to make things happen. But in order to make something happen, you need a feasibility study. You need meetings where anchors are brought together and trust building. And all of that requires some resources on the front end to seed a strategy like this. I'd say the second thing, in addition to the anchors, the role of the community foundation and other local funders, there really needs, and Walter sort of alluded to this when he talked about our two big hospital systems, they're fierce competitors. I mean, they're out, taking each other's doctors, and getting bigger market share and all of that. So creating a safe space, an environment in which leaders of these institutions at all levels can sit down and build trust, still be competitors, but build trust and find shared efforts that they could work on is very important. And here, the Cleveland Foundation not only put up the ongoing seed money, not only assigned some of their staff to work on a very significant part of their jobs to get this strategy of Evergreen and Greater University Circle off the ground, but the foundation used its convening power to bring together the large anchors. And there's a roughly quarterly meeting of the heads of all these institutions to talk about how they can work together. What's the next project? Where do they go next with this? So that's important also because, local anchor institutions, they're big players. They don't respond well to a community group coming and knocking on their door and saying, we'd like to do something for the community. But they trust a local foundation because they see them as a peer institution, and they're willing to sit down and talk about things.
Yeah.
So
and
we've got very little time left, and we're doing a great job of answering Nikki's second question, but maybe not fully her first question. So if I can interject just for a second. So in terms of three, key things to ensure the success of this work, it sounds like clearly starting with a player like a community foundation that's seen as a partner, as an equal, as somebody that has the convening power to get anchor institutions to pay attention, to pause, to get into the room, and then really working over time to develop those relationships as key. I heard ultimately developing a database as key. Sounds like we could do a whole webinar just on that piece, as you step through a strategy. But I want to get to this question about revenue. Is is there, how many staff, how much upfront funding do you think you've put in, the seed funding at the Cleveland Foundation? And is there any piece of this that becomes revenue generating, or is it all a loss leader for ultimately money that comes back to the community, but not necessarily the Cleveland Foundation who's seeding the work?
Right. The Cleveland Foundation, on an annual basis, the Cleveland Foundation is putting several $100,000, I would say, into this strategy because they have a commitment to community development. So this is part of their commitment to community development. They've also assigned 2 of their staff, senior program directors, who are spending about 75% of their time on this. But again, they'd be spending their time on something else related to the community. We've created a revolving loan fund here in Cleveland, where we have raised from a number of sources, the Cleveland Foundation, but the anchor institutions, other local philanthropy, about $6 million over the last 4 years or so has gone into that fund as a revolving loan fund to help with the initial capitalization of these companies. All of that money is grant money and it's salaries, so that's not coming back to the foundation. But what it's doing and what the foundation board finds interesting is if this strategy works, we're building a network of for-profit businesses. We're helping to seed them, but at the end of the day, those businesses are not going to keep coming back for more and more philanthropic dollars as a nonprofit would. They're going to be able to stand on their own. They're going to create payroll. They're going to pay taxes to the general fund of the city. So the Cleveland Foundation feels it's very unusual for a foundation to do a for-profit business development strategy, but they think that that's the sensible thing in terms of the use of their dollars. But it's not a cheap strategy. I mean, if you're building a commercial scale laundry, you're going to spend $5 or $6 million to capitalize something like that just by virtue of the equipment.
Yeah, and not everything I think has to be that capital intensive, but I just want to point out that what we're doing here too in the anchor strategy in terms of purchasing, we're trying to create some interventions to test the theory that will prove to them that this is worth their effort to do so, that ultimately these costs will be borne by the institutions themselves. I don't think we want to make something that relies upon grant funding forever. What we're trying to prove is that this makes economic sense to them and that at some point they can take over the costs to some degree and that it will be self-sustaining. And also to put it in context, the Cleveland Foundation invests $80 million a year from their endowment in the community. So it's the second largest foundation in the world, and we can do things on a certain scale that not every community can. But I don't think you need to necessarily, there's no sort of benchmark level. I think you can do things that are smaller, low cost, cooperative work, directing the anchor purchasing in such a way can be done for probably on a smaller scale and for less money than we're investing here.
Absolutely. In Amarillo, the community foundation there, I think it has about $180 million endowment. So it's a fairly small community foundation, and yet they're moving forward with what they call the Panhandle Wealth Building Initiative. They're not going to put millions of dollars into a fund, but they're finding other ways to approach this. Great.
Well, I think this has been very helpful. I imagine we could easily do follow-ups on, kind of diving deeper in different pieces of this strategy. So we will continue to promote the web links and some of the resources therein. We'll keep following what you're doing. Walter, we know you've indicated, you're still at the earlier stages and walking through a lot of these challenges. So we'll keep following what you're doing and trying to report out to our broader community what works. And you guys earlier in the slides had referenced a number of other communities who are doing this. There's 15 other communities, as you said, doing Evergreen strategies, but there's other communities that are doing maybe not the full Evergreen strategy, but working on anchor institution procurement. And for anybody who hasn't seen it yet, I'm not sure if it's live. It will be in the next couple of days. Ted has written a blog entry on the BALLE blog at bealocalist.org, which will point to some additional case studies of communities that are doing this work. So next month, as I said, we're going to look at a model in Detroit that has been not super resource intensive on the front end, but that has succeeded in transitioning and redirecting about $17 million in spending. So we're going to keep exploring over the coming months how all of us can begin walking toward encouraging local procurement. And really just appreciate your time today, Ted and Walter, in starting to help us understand what's been happening in Cleveland. And I'll just remind everyone that after each webinar, we email a link to the call audio, the presentation materials, and a copy of the questions in the chat window. So watch for that in the next couple of days. And if you want to keep the conversation going and you're a BALLE member, we've got affinity groups on Local First that are running for folks to be providing ongoing peer support and sharing resources, for example, on local procurement, just as David Curry is doing in the work that's happening in Binghamton. So I appreciate everybody's attendance today and the good questions. We'll keep going deeper on this. And Ted and Walter, thank you very much for your time.
You're welcome.
Thank you very much.
All right. Thanks, everyone. Happy Thursday.
All conference hosts have hung up. This conference is over. Thank you.